Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to see you here to talk about my new book, Dinner with Churchill, Policy Making at the Dinner Table. Since my book is all about the importance of dinners, be assured that I will not make you late for your own dinners. I will be brief. I just want to whet your appetite so that you'll buy my book. Do you want to? Let's try another sentence. I have lived with Winston Churchill for 4 years, and it was wonderful, even though that took place in the frigid archives at Churchill College. I'm often asked where I got the idea for still another book on Churchill to add to the thousands already written. Well, I've read many books about this fascinating man and noticed that many of his important accomplishments were achieved at dinners, sometimes at lunches. So I began to wonder why that was so, why most of the deals that were struck at the famous international conferences held during World War II were made at or facilitated by dinners at which the leaders were more relaxed than at formal sessions. So I began digging into the Churchill archives. Not only did I find menus for the more famous dinners with Presidents Roosevelt and Truman and with Stalin, but there were details of Churchill carefully setting the stage for dinners with his generals, political friends, and foes, leading academics, and a host, pardon the pun, of interesting people. His dinners usually included 12 to 15 people, and very often members of his own family. And stage these dinners is the right description, as in Churchill indeed loved to perform at these affairs. He loved company, he loved the attention he got as he entertained, and more important, wooed his guests. At one dinner, he described with great exuberance the naval battle of Jutland, using wine glasses and decanters to show the position of the ships, and blowing smoke from his cigar to imitate the cannon fire. It would have been wonderful to have been there. The topics at Churchill's table were wide-ranging: hot and cold bath taps, tank treads, floating harbors, movies. That Hamilton woman was a great favorite of Churchill's. And of course, politics. His curiosity was boundless. Many of his guests wrote to friends or recorded in their diaries his conversation, repeated his anecdotes, and commented on the food he served. In addition, I found hundreds of bills for dinners he gave at the London hotels, Claridge's, the Ritz, and the Savoy, with guest lists, amended wine lists, many letters from Churchill complaining about overbilling, thanking his friends for gifts of food and wines, arranging generous tips for the hotel waiters, all in the archives, all set out in my book. I have produced many of the menus in my book, in case any of you want to try to duplicate one or two of them at a special party at home. The wine list might be harder for you to replicate since so many decades have passed since Churchill placed his orders. I have also noted his musical choices should you be in the mood to hire a band for your party, your Churchill party. I wrote about all of this because they shed light on the care Churchill took to make these meals productive, to sell his policies. They also show how his staff struggled to meet his requirements in such remote places as Tehran, Casablanca, and Yalta. I describe his choice of and use of cigars to prolong after-dinner discussions. My research told me what he ate and what he drank and with whom, and how he interacted with staff and with the British people during the war. Somehow, my hero turned to reality, a human being with definite reactions, very negative reactions, to White House cooking, to mixed cocktails served by hosts to him across the world, to cheap cigars, which the U.S. military tried to get away with giving him, to arguments from his generals, and to diet warnings and suggestions from his wife. These were largely ignored, especially the one that involved his eating only tomatoes. As I dug into all these materials, it became clear to me that for someone with Churchill's great conversational skill and his ability to create a congenial setting, meals had an advantage over most kinds of meetings. They could be as long as he liked, and in the case of dinners, they could run into the wee hours, when Churchill gathered strength and others tired. His daughter Mary reports that luncheon and dinner conversations often became so extended that mealtimes tended to prolong themselves far into the afternoon or evening, with luncheons lasting sometimes until 3:30. A typical evening, let's say, at Chequers, which is the Prime Minister's country house, would begin at 8:30 with champagne in the drawing room. Dinner would last from 9 to 10:30, then cigars after the ladies were excused. When the men had rejoined the ladies, 20 minutes or a half hour later, a movie would be shown, even in wartime, until about midnight, when Churchill would announce, "Now to work." And he would dictate and work until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And the next morning he would wake at 7 a.m. to start work again, in bed, surrounded by staff and military personnel until lunch. The more I read the reports of these meals by those lucky enough to attend them, the clearer it became to me that these were working meals, not social occasions. Although Churchill hugely enjoyed them, he did love company. Churchill used those hours spent at the table to educate others about his policies, to persuade them to go along, and to learn from his guests the latest political and social gossip, and to get news from around the world. Remember, there was no 24-hour news cycle in those days, and so private reports of well-placed guests were often the best source of what was going on in, say, the Soviet Union. His guests came from all walks of life, although during the war they were mainly military and politicians, British and American. And when Churchill felt he could tolerate it, he once in a while had to dine with Charles de Gaulle. But there was always a purpose to the dinners: to advance his country's interests, to explain, to cajole, to learn, to exchange information. It was the conversation that mattered. The setting, the table, and the food were the stage on which he could best perform. Here are just two examples of dinners with important purposes and outcomes. The White House in December 1941, more about this later. And a second important dinner was in August 1942, when Churchill, after several long, grueling, and dangerous flights to avoid German fighters in the air, flew to Moscow to meet Stalin for the first time. Churchill had to bring a message that there would be no second front in 1942, an Allied front that Stalin hoped would divert German troops from his Soviet front lines. Churchill wisely took U.S. Ambassador Averell Harriman with him to show that the Allies were united in this important strategic decision. After a full day of meetings, Stalin invited Churchill to the Kremlin for a goodbye dinner, and what a dinner that was. Just the two men and their interpreters, serving themselves, no servants, in the Kremlin, a full banquet, enough for 30 people, topped off, pardon the pun, with a pig's head. Stalin opened his penknife, cleaned out the head, scraped out a piece of meat, which he then offered to Churchill on the end of his knife. Churchill politely refused, not able to show his disgust to his new ally, but commenting later to his doctor that the food was filthy. That's a quote. No matter, Churchill got what he wanted. Stalin agreed to the Allied strategy. Let me spend a few minutes on what I mean when I say that Churchill's attention to detail was stunning. He designed the table at his country home, Chartwell. It was to be round and 6 feet in diameter. He told his wife to order chairs with arms to allow for relaxation, to ease the conversation, and to permit his guests to be comfortable for long periods of time. In a letter to Clemmy, he wrote, quote, "One does not want the dining room chair spreading itself or its arms as if it were a plant." She, in like vein, quote, digested his dissertation. He always planned the seating to make sure that the conversation flowed. In my book, there's an excerpt from his long memo on the proper design of dining rooms. So if any of you have in mind redoing your own dining room, let me know and I'll get you a copy of his memo. In 1909, the newlywed Churchills bought a house in London. His mother and Clemmy decorated it, and Churchill added a dining room at the back of the house. They employed a cook, 2 maids, and a butler. Roy Jenkins, a very good biographer, said of Churchill, quote, "He was not mostly good at bilateral conversation, but with a table he could often be brilliant." "If I could dine with Stalin once a week, there would be no trouble," Churchill said. The British and Commonwealth countries had been at war for over a year when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Churchill knew that the U.S. would be at war and wanted to ensure that America would not concentrate on fighting Japan first instead of fighting Hitler in Europe.